Hello everybody, how are you all doing today? So, in my previous video on white privilege, I briefly mentioned the concept of big government. Since it is such a common talking point used by conservatives, I decided I would do a video on the concept of big government versus small government.
I'm pretty sure you all know that I'm a small government guy.
My point is that overall, if you're talking about the level of government spending, it needs to go down, and you believe that it really needs to go up.
Do you trust the government? And they will usually typically say no. And then you say, then why do you want to make it bigger?
The bigger the government, the smaller the citizen.
Have you ever seen one of those ridiculous political spectrums that put liberals on the same side as fascists and anarchists on the same side as conservatives on the basis of government size or individual liberty? That's because of this idea. The right believes in liberty and quote-unquote small government, whereas leftists are authoritarian and believe in the power of big government. Now, how do we define big government versus small government, since authoritarian is perhaps a bit of a loose definition? In this regard, it's typically defined in a few ways. First is the idea of more power to the states than the federal government. Immediately, this has visible flaws. If a state government is doing the exact same things that would be considered big government if the federal government did it, it wouldn't change anything. It would just be big government but applied to less people. You can have 50 state-level big governments serving the same purpose as a big federal government, and it really wouldn't make a difference in whether you have a big or a small government. Not only that, but historically, federal government has been used numerous times to stop oppression committed by state governments, such as when the federal government stepped in to end slavery, segregation, and other systems of oppression that existed in various states. In all of these cases, states' rights was used as an excuse to continue the oppression that was going on at the state level. The next idea is budget. If the government spends a lot, it's big. If it doesn't spend a lot, it's small. Except here's the thing. If conservatives really want to decrease our spending and consider it evil big government, there are plenty of ways to do it, such as cutting back on what is by far the world's largest military budget, cutting back on corporate welfare, not paying for private prisons, which actually cost more than government-run prisons, etc. And this leads to the last idea, which is intertwined with the previous one, which is how much stuff the government does, and most often this is interpreted as in how many services it provides. Except here's the thing, no government dictatorship that went around violating human rights ever did so by simply providing universal healthcare, subsidized higher education, or food stamps. The fact is that there are very few people who really want the government to do less stuff. The only people who do are anarchists and some libertarians. But the fact is that those ideologies aren't that popular because most people have ideologies that are based in wanting the government to do certain things and uphold certain values. Progressives want the government to provide food stamps to keep people from starving, provide free or subsidized education to allow for greater opportunity for all, support universal healthcare so that people don't die because they can't afford treatment, and in general, provide services meant to help the lower and middle class. While progressives want the government to do stuff to benefit its citizens, conservatives typically want government to also do stuff, just not stuff that benefits its citizens. This includes increasing our already massive military budget, militarizing and giving more power to police, funding for-profit private prisons and supporting a prison industrial complex, giving corporate welfare, legally enforcing socially conservative values, stopping gay people from marrying or adopting, stopping trans people from using the bathroom, fighting a never-ending war on drugs, bailing out companies and industries, making abortion illegal, attempting to push prayer and stop the teaching of evolution and climate science in public schools, tracking down and deporting undocumented immigrants, building and maintaining a 2,000-mile wall on the border with Mexico. You get the picture. The idea that one either supports small government liberty or big government tyranny, central to the conservative libertarian myth, is historically inaccurate. Take the French Revolution as an example, in which people fighting for liberté, égalité, fraternité, I probably butcher that because I don't speak French, ended up cutting off people's heads during the Reign of Terror. American Southerners rebelled during the Civil War, claiming they believed in states' rights, while they had previously supported strict federally enacted fugitive slave laws on northern states. In Brazil, in response to the big left-wing government that many felt had failed them, the people elected right-wing politician Jair Bolsonaro as their president, a man who has praised Brazil's former military dictatorship. Even Marx and Engels wanted a classless, stateless society, yet they clearly had no qualms about using a powerful government to achieve that goal. And clearly, conservatives aren't any more innocent. They want less regulations and welfare programs, sure, but they are also the ones who believe in strict border security, a larger military budget, and a more powerful police force. It's always the right that promises to be super tough on crime. And remember how I mentioned Bolsonaro before? Yeah, conservatives support him too. Anyway, now that that has been said, I would also like to directly respond to a couple of videos today, the links to both of which will be in the description of this video so that you can be sure I'm not misrepresenting them. The first of which is ultimate libtard destroyer Ben Shapiro in a debate with Cenk Uygur. Now personally, I'm not a huge fan of Cenk Uygur or the Young Turks, but I still think that he makes a good point here, pretty similar to what I've been saying, and Ben Shapiro tries to debunk it with his own counter-argument, which I would like to address.
So just admit it. It's no problem. Just say it. Say I love big government. It's okay. So you're talking about when you like when you're rich and you want tax cuts. Oh no, I don't want big government. I want small government. But when it's convenient for you and you'd like oil subsidies and you'd like wars and you'd like to meddle in people's private lives, then you love big government.
Okay, so as you can see here, he made a pretty similar point to what I was just saying. Conservatives also support big government, just in their own special way. Now, let's listen to Ben's response.
Okay, I need to respond to some of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to point out that Cenk's big government, small government dichotomy was proposed by you, not by me. I talk about the proper scope of the government's involvement in particular areas the same way that you do, and we may disagree on all of that. My point is that overall, if you're talking about the level of government spending, it needs to go down, and you believe that it really needs to go up. Okay, so it's disingenuous.
It depends. Not on war, does it?
No, but overall...
Not on the war on drugs. Not on so many of those wasteful programs. It depends, but let me...
Overall, you want the federal budget increased. Overall, I would like the federal budget decreased. To pretend that this is not true is to lie. Okay, and when you suggest that there is no difference between, we just have different visions of what the government should cover, these things cost different things. Okay, the war in Iraq was very expensive. You know what's more expensive? Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. All of these are vastly more expensive than the war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
So really the crux of Ben's argument here is that, yeah, he may also support big government, but his big government costs less than Cenk's big government. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Facts and Logic himself. Now, it's true that different programs cost different things, but if you cut down on those highly unnecessary programs and initiatives we spend on that people like Ben support, you would still be moving towards a smaller government that uses less money, which means that while it may be true that Cenk does not want small government, Ben doesn't really want small government either. What he really wants is for the government to do the things that he wants that just so happen to cost less. It would be one thing if the war on drugs, massive military budgets, corporate welfare, and other things conservatives like to spend on were absolute necessities, but they are not. At least not more so than programs designed to keep people from starving because they can't afford food or dying because they can't afford healthcare. Ben Shapiro actually does bring up Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as big governments, programs designed to help the poor and elderly that are supported by the vast majority of the American populace. Social Security and Medicare, in particular, are programs you rarely find conservatives going after because they know that the elderly portion of their voting base supports it. So it's interesting how Ben calls it big government, knowing that, in general, both liberals and conservatives support Social Security and Medicare, or at least for conservatives, they pretend to. This would beg the question, if conservatives really think small government is so good, why must they at least publicly support quote-unquote big government programs like Social Security and Medicare? Cenk also mentions that Social Security is a sort of separate program that we specifically pay into while we are young and then benefit from as we get older. But of course, Ben refuses to address that point and pretty much ignores it while the audience applauds. As for stuff like the war on drugs and the Iraq War, those are examples of a big, powerful government using its power to cause harm, which may be less expensive than social programs, but involve far more actual oppression by the government. And the people know this, which is why most people support Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and oppose the Iraq War and the war on drugs. One category is programs that help citizens, and the other is overreach by a powerful, big government. Guess which one conservatives support?
Now, as far as this, again, going back to this idea that, again, I don't like this big government dichotomy any more than you do, in the sense that you say, well, it's big government for the government to get inside people's wombs. And I say that it is the government's job to preserve life, liberty, and property, and one of those things is life.
Now, I acknowledge that abortion is a touchy subject, and a lot of people have different opinions on it. As a former pro-life conservative turned pro-choice progressive myself, I'm actually a bit critical about how a lot of leftists approach the abortion debate, and I plan to make a video at some point myself addressing the topic. Either way, I think we can all see another issue here. For someone who is anti-abortion and sees abortion as killing a human being, laws against abortion make sense and are necessary. However, for someone who is pro-choice and does not believe a fetus to be a sentient human, this is a big government overreach. And the fact that this dispute exists shows that what is or is not a necessity for government to do can be arbitrarily defined by what someone believes. All that really does is muddy the waters for what does and does not count as big government or government overreach. Anyway, now that Libtard Wrecker 9000 has been sufficiently addressed, I would like to do a response to the most elite, quote-unquote, academic institution of the political right, Prager University, and not just with any random speaker PragerU happens to invite in, but with the Jewish evangelical grandfather of the American conservative movement himself, Dennis Prager, in a video called How Big Should Government Be? Left versus Right, number 1. The title isn't entirely representative of the video, since it's not entirely about how big government should be, but it's really more about how the left is evil because they believe in big government. I have two reasons for responding specifically to this video. The first is that it has over 4 million views, which means it is probably a good idea to address it. And the other reason is that it pretty neatly summarizes specific fears conservatives have with a big leftist government, so going through this video I feel would be pretty useful to understanding the whole debate.
One of the most important differences between the left and the right is how each regards the role and the size of the government. The left believes that the state should be the most powerful force in society.
Well, no. The government should not be an all-powerful source controlling society, but ultimately a democratically elected government is the best institution to mediate conflicts between various forces in our society, whether they be individuals, groups, or other public and private institutions. I mean, that's kind of the primary role of the state, to uphold law and order and settle disputes. Conservatives also believe this, more so than the left even. Remember, Republicans claim to be the party of law and order and believe we need to be tougher on crime.
Among many other things, the government should be in control of educating every child.
Again, no. The government does not have to be the one providing the education to every child, but they should ensure education for every child, which means providing a public school system so that those who cannot afford to or do not want to go to private school have that option. Either Prager is insisting that progressives want an end to all private schools, which is a straw man, or he is saying that public education should not exist, which is ridiculous.
Should provide all health care.
Most American progressives don't want a nationalized healthcare system in which the government controls the entire healthcare industry. What progressives do want is Medicare for all. We are totally fine with doctors having private practices and hospitals being privately run, but we believe that the services they provide should be paid for by the government. This is what's known as a single-payer healthcare system. PoliDice recently released a really good video in which he explains different systems of universal healthcare, and I will link it in the description of this video. But really, the point here is that the reason so many Americans want some form of universal healthcare is because private institutions are failing to make healthcare accessible to all people. It's no coincidence that all other developed countries with universal healthcare have better healthcare systems than us.
And should regulate often to the minutest detail how businesses conduct their business.
The left isn't trying to tell businesses how to exactly run their business down to the minutest detail. They're specifically placing regulations to ensure safe environment, minimal pollution, basic security for workers, and just in general, stopping the businesses from doing things to harm people. Meanwhile, with regards to business, conservatives practice corporate welfare, which makes corporations more powerful, sometimes even at the cost of small businesses. It's still big government. And even if there was no corporate welfare and conservatives just left it at no regulations, corporations would still destroy small businesses. So a lot of these regulations that are supposedly telling people how to run their businesses actually benefit small businessmen. Prager is trying to oversimplify this to make it sound like some horrible authoritarian thing.
In Germany, for instance, the government legislates the time of day stores have to close.
Okay, cool, I guess. No progressive is trying to promote that here. Although, if you really want to make this a left-right thing, keep in mind that these laws were passed in capitalist West Germany in 1956. In East Germany, which was a far-left communist country, they did not have any of these restrictions, and when East Germany joined West Germany in 1990, they were immediately subject to stricter shopping laws. Now, I am not saying we should be like communist East Germany, but clearly to make this a left versus right thing is a bit dishonest.
In short, there should ideally be no power that competes with government. Not parents.
So what government activity exactly does Prager consider to be government overreach onto parents? Is it the government stopping gay parents from adopting children, which is something mostly just conservatives support? Is it the government stepping in to stop child abuse, which is something that pretty much everyone supports? This whole idea that the left wants government to control the ability of parents is completely ridiculous. The only time the left wants the government to step in is when parents are harming their children.
Not businesses.
Already made this point, so moving on.
Not private schools.
Citation needed.
Not religious institutions.
We don't care if you want to practice your religion, just don't go forcing it onto other people or, God forbid, using big government to do it like when conservatives fought tooth and nail against gay marriage.
Not even the individual human conscience.
Conservatives don't want individuals to be more powerful than the government either. Again, which party is the party of law and order? What specifically does Prager mean by the individual being more powerful than the government? Someone who can just get away with whatever they want because they themselves are more powerful than the entire government? Or does it just refer to how much the government gets involved in someone's personal life? Because trust me, it's not the liberals chanting "my body, my choice" and who want to allow gay and trans people to marry each other and use their preferred bathrooms that are doing that.
Conservatives, on the other hand, believe the government's role in society should be limited to absolute necessities, such as national defense, and to being the resource of last resort to help citizens who cannot be helped by family, by community, or by religious and secular charities.
Again, here we see what he defines as absolute necessities being completely arbitrary. Sure, a national defense is necessary, but is it absolutely necessary to have a military budget larger than the next 8 largest military budgets in the world combined? And what about all those other programs, initiatives, and institutions conservatives support that he just conveniently leaves out, that I mentioned before? And clearly, because there are people in this country struggling to afford food, healthcare, housing, and other basic necessities, clearly family, community, and religious and secular charities aren't doing the job. So under Prager's logic, wouldn't all those liberal or even social democratic welfare programs supported by the left also be necessities? No? In that case, it seems like the place that you draw the line between necessity and non-necessity is quite arbitrary.
Conservatives understand that as governments grow in size and power, the following will inevitably happen. 1. There will be ever-increasing amounts of corruption. Power and money breed corruption. People in government will sell government influence for personal and political gain, and people outside government will seek to buy influence and favors.
Except that already happens. Politicians in our country are always being bought out by lobbyists and corporate interests. But us on the left actually want to stop that from happening via campaign finance reform. So if you want to actually work together on this because you also want to keep money out of politics, okay, never mind. Looks like PragerU actually did a video on how campaign finance reform is bad, which I will link in the description if you want to check that out. And as you can see, people in the comments section seem to have caught on. Well, no real surprises there, as this may be a good time to mention that PragerU itself is financed by the Wilks brothers, who are fracking billionaires, and this seems to explain why PragerU puts out so much stuff denying climate change and talking about how flawless the free market is. Now, if you think I'm just calling Prager a hypocrite hypocrite here, you would be correct. I am. But I would also like to talk more about corruption. What usually happens when politicians get bought out by corrupt interests? They support deregulating business, oppose environmental protection bills, and generally do things that specifically the left is opposed to. When was the last time a politician was bought out to support universal healthcare and environmental protection? I rest my case.
In Africa and Latin America, government corruption has been the single biggest factor holding nations back from progressing.
That's true, but that's not the result of big left-wing government as Prager describes. In fact, plenty of these places do have capitalists and sometimes even under-regulated market economies, and it will be wealthy people with economic interests who are buying out the government. Most of these countries aren't European-style social democracies. I would briefly like to show this clip from a PoliDice video to illustrate a point regarding the Latin American countries, and I will also link his video in the description.
So let's compare these Latin American countries to the big government social democracies that progressive Democrats want to turn America into. Denmark and Sweden are those commonly listed. I chose Guatemala because she's from Guatemala and specifically mentioned a few times. I chose Mexico and Brazil since they're the two most populated countries in Latin America. First thing you notice is that Denmark and Sweden are much wealthier than Guatemala, Mexico, Brazil, especially Guatemala. Now, are Guatemala, Mexico, and Brazil big government socialist countries? Well, let's look at the statistics. Government spending in Denmark and Sweden is 58 and 51% of their GDP respectively. In Guatemala, it's 15%. In Mexico, it's 27%. And in Brazil, it's 39%. Even the highest, Brazil, isn't close to Sweden or Denmark. Let's look at the tax burden. The tax burden in Denmark is 48% of their GDP and 45% of Sweden's. In Guatemala, it's 11%. In Mexico, it's 11%. In Brazil, it's 35%. So Brazil, compared to Guatemala and Mexico, is a little big government-ish, but not comparative to Denmark and Sweden, the countries that we're trying to make America into. Let's look at public sector employment. So what percentage of the labor force is employed by the government? In Denmark and Sweden, it's 31 and 30%. In Guatemala, it's 12%. In Mexico, it's 14%. And in Brazil, it's around 16%. I found different sources giving different numbers, so I just even them out 16%. I was going to point out that the minimum wages of Latin American countries are very low, very low. None of these countries have minimum wages above $2 an hour. But there are several factors that make that comparison unfair, so I chose to leave that out to be intellectually honest. And of course, Denmark and Sweden have universal healthcare and universal education, while Guatemala and Mexico do not, and Brazil doesn't have universal healthcare, but they do have free education. So no, these are not in any way the big government socialist countries that you're claiming they are.
It's also important to note that they are poor for other reasons, such as colonial legacy, and especially in the case of Latin America, American imperialism. In Africa, many states are based on old, arbitrary colonial borders designed by European powers without respect to the local populations in order to divide and conquer. There have also been cases where countries in Latin America with left-wing governments have been overthrown by coups supported by the United States government and corporations, bringing far-right fascist dictators to power. But dictatorship? That's big government, yet American and corporate interests don't sound very left-wing. Well, that fact does seem to expose a little flaw in your analysis now, does it?
2. Individual liberty will decline. With a few exceptions, such as an unrestricted right to abortion, individual liberty is less important to the left than to the right.
Citation needed.
This is neither an opinion nor a criticism. It is simple logic.
Wow, for simple logic free of opinion and criticism, it sure sounds like a pretty loaded statement.
The more control the government has over people's lives, the less liberty people have.
What examples specifically does he have of left-wing social programs depriving people of liberty? If anything, having a social and economic safety net makes people more free because they don't have to worry about, starving to death. When the GI Bill promised grants to veterans returning from World War II, it gave people unprecedented freedom to invest and improve their lives because now they had the resources and safety to do so. Imagine how much freer people would be if they weren't burdened by ridiculously high medical bills and tuition and student loans. What is more harmful to liberty? Socialized medicine, subsidized higher education and welfare, or a massive military budget, unchecked militarized police, the prison industrial complex driven by for-profit prisons, the war on drugs, various systems put in place by the war on terror, corporate welfare, a ridiculously strict immigration system, deportations, prayer in schools, banning the teaching of evolution and climate science, traditional marriage laws, prohibition against gay adoption, banning abortion, pretty much
any sort of legal enforcement of social conservatism, and the list goes on and on. Which side's programs are more harmful to liberty? Sure, maybe you can make some argument that those progressive social programs have some sort of economic downsides, and we can have a whole other debate on the economic side of these issues. But don't pretend that your opposition to them is rooted in the ideals of liberty.
3. Countries with ever-expanding governments will either reduce the size of their government or eventually collapse economically.
Well, it's a good thing American progressives don't want an ever-expanding government, then. They want to reach a point in which people aren't living on the streets because even the most basic housing is too expensive, aren't starving because they cannot afford food, aren't deprived access to higher education, whether it be college or trade school, because it is too expensive, and aren't dying because they cannot afford medical care. That's why progressives are specifically pushing for programs to make these things more accessible. They want social democracy, not communism, and not even actual socialism. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, South Korea, Japan, and most of Europe are social democracies with healthy market economies, and their governments aren't ever expanding towards communism. This point again speaks for itself, talking about how it will either end up reducing or collapsing. Exactly. If things were to somehow go too far, we would have the ability to reduce the programs we've created.
Every welfare state ultimately becomes a Ponzi scheme, relying on new payers to pay previous payers. And when it runs out of the new payers, the scheme collapses. All the welfare states of the world, including wealthy European countries, are already experiencing this problem to varying degrees.
Okay, so I'm sure he'll give some examples. Oh, nope, never mind. But anyway, here's why that example is wrong. Yes, it is true that in social democracy, most people get more out of the government than they pay in. But the people who are paying more aren't just dying off. Those people are the rich, and the rich people just aren't dying out as a social class in social democracies. Now, it's only a Ponzi scheme, like Prager described, in cases where the young are supporting the old in a country with an aging population. But this is a factor in pretty much any country with an aging population, regardless of economic model, because you're still going to need all of those younger adults to pay for the elderly, whether it's young people directly caring for their own grandparents or young people having to pay into social programs to help the elderly. But anyway, let's think about the actual repercussions of this if it were implemented as policy. It would mean cutting programs like Social Security, a program that many elderly people rely on, having paid into it themselves when they were young, and you'd be committing political suicide if you decided to remove it. Social democracies are also incredibly economically stable, often even more stable than the US, with typically lower debt-to-GDP ratios and AAA credit ratings. If you want to learn more, I would like to recommend yet another PoliDice video. Yes, I know I've referenced him quite a lot today, titled Debunking 20 Arguments Against Social Democracy, and I will again leave a link in the description below.
4. In order to pay for an ever-expanding government, taxes are constantly increased.
Again, with this whole ever-increasing thing, the left doesn't just want big government for big government's sake. They have specific goals. And while it's true that taxes will increase for left-wing programs, taxes also increase to cover the costs of the military budget and other programs and initiatives conservatives support. At least with social programs, the majority of people gain more from the system than they pay in.
But at a given level of taxation, the society's wealth producers will either stop working, work less, hire fewer people, or move their business out of the state or out of the country.
Then why hasn't that happened in other social democracies? Why are they still financially stable?
The country. 5. Big government produces big deficits and ever-increasing and ultimately unsustainable debt.
Again, conservative programs add to the deficit too. Bush Jr. increased the national debt by 101%, and Reagan increased it by 186%. Not only that, but as already stated, plenty of social democracies have far less debt than the US.
This too is only logical. The more money the state hands out, the more money people will demand from the state. No recipient of free money has ever said, "Thank you, I have enough." Unless big governments get smaller, they will all eventually collapse under their own weight, with terrible consequences socially as well as economically.
That's just not how welfare works. People don't just go pick up their food stamps and then take more by simply demanding more of them. And it hasn't been a problem in any social democracies. This is just a classic slippery slope fallacy.
6. The bigger the government, the greater the opportunities for doing great evil. The 20th century was the most murderous century in recorded history. And who did all this killing? Big governments. Evil individuals without power can do only so much harm. But when evil individuals take control of a big government, the amount of harm they can do is essentially unlimited. The right fears big government. The left fears big business. But Coca-Cola can't break into your house or confiscate your wealth. Only big government can do that. As irresponsible as any big business has ever been, it is only big government that can build concentration camps and commit genocide.
Except Stalin, Hitler, and Mao didn't kill people with free healthcare and access to higher education. They killed people by, killing them. Hitler didn't just lure Jews into gas chambers by promising them social programs. That's not how that works. Are you seriously implying that a government with such a massive military and powerful police force needs left-wing social programs in order to start killing people? Now, I guess you can make a case that Stalin's and Mao's economic policies did actually cause harm, but no one on the left is trying to turn the US into the Soviet Union or communist China. We're not trying to seize the means of production here. We're just trying to provide basic social programs, something that plenty of countries have done just fine without killing millions of people. As for Hitler, it wasn't his big government economic policies that made him evil. It was the fact that he tried to conquer all of Europe and committed genocide. You know what he did use to do those things? A large military, a powerful police force, you get the picture. Hitler wasn't a leftist. Just like Bolsonaro in Brazil, he was a far-right reactionary authoritarian. As for the big business argument, we're not worried that big businesses are coming into our homes and killing us. We're worried about them forcing people to work for slave wages, selling unsafe products to turn a profit, killing smaller businesses, causing massive pollution, and lobbying the government to support their own interests. We're not calling on government to oppress people instead of business. We're calling on government to keep business in check.
7. Big government eats away at the moral character of a nation. People no longer take care of other people. After all, they know the government will do that. That's why Americans give far more of their money and volunteer far more of their time to charity than do Europeans at the same economic level.
And why do you think that is? Is it because Europeans are immoral and hate their fellow man? No, it's because there are already systems in place that make it so that people don't need charity. Shouldn't any person giving charity do so desiring for a world where their charity is no longer necessary? Guess what? They have now achieved that in most of Europe. Honestly, if you care more that people are giving to charity than that people are getting the help they need, then you don't really care about those in need. You just care that people who give to charity are able to feel good about it.
Without the belief in an ever-expanding government, there is no left. Without a belief in limited government, there is no right. I'm Dennis Prager.
So, watching Prager's video, we learn a few things. Not only are all of Prager's arguments against left-wing big government wrong or inapplicable to the American left, but he also seems to ignore how some of this even applies to programs that conservatives also support. It's almost as if the conservative libertarian idea of big government is just an empty talking point that is entirely made up in order to dismiss progressives as evil authoritarians. And that's because it is. Think about it like this. It will seem like a strange analogy, but you have to bear with me. Government is like a penis. People love to talk about its size, and people often lie about its size, but as long as you are in a certain range, what really matters is what you do with it. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe to my channel, hit the bell to receive notifications, and please let me know in the comments if you have any feedback or what you would like me to review next.